Hello, I'm your host, Charmaine, and welcome to Beautiful Gems. I want to talk a little bit about intuition. This is the first of the protective gear that I mentioned, and I wanted to start out with this because I feel like intuition it's appropriate after everything that we have spoken about. We've spoken about prayer, we've spoken about meditation and stillness and, nature. These things are ways to ask God and also be in the presence of God and of yourself to receive answers from your intuition. So those things put you in a position to receive. And to me, that's what intuition is. It is receiving information from the source, receiving information from God. It's our spiritual compass, if you will, right? And it's just so important to tune in with those tools, with that heavy machinery that I talked about before, right? But the intuition itself, it provides protection. Sometimes, I call it protective gear, but sometimes intuition provides protection literally. If you're someone that's tuned into your intuition, you understand what that means. So intuition, I feel like, can come in obviously different states, but we're going to talk about two specific states, right? Instinct and this type of flow state. And that's my own description of it, so I'll explain. Instinct, I think, is very self-explanatory. That's that gut feeling that you get that just comes out of nowhere and just hits you like boom. And I think that most people they are tuned in enough to receive those type of gut, feelings, if you want to say, or gut information. And there's a reason why I want to separate it from feelings. I want to say like that gut information. Whereas when you're in this flow state, see, that's when you're quiet, you're meditating, stillness, you're out in nature. It's a different type of hearing or receiving, where that voice, I know many of you have heard of it like that, or people talk about it, that still small voice, right? Well, here's the thing. If everything around you is loud, including your mind, then you won't be able to hear it. And sometimes those are the most important, like the most pivotal times for you to hear it. It's always important to hear your intuition. But I find that information, if you can tune into it, it's life-changing. In the sense of, it's that little voice that told you that person is not for you, but you don't listen. It's that voice that tells you to go for it and take that new job, even though you're scared. Because when you listen to that small voice, usually it can, or it has the capability, I should say, to provide you with information that you would not see with your naked eye. Information that you're not privy to, right? It's this, again, this knowing. So there's a difference between this instinct and this flow state. When you're in that flow state, it's a quiet voice. But when it's instinctual, it's loud, right? It might be something that's trying to protect you in this immediate future. If you're a person that practices prayer, meditation, and some of the techniques that we talked about as far as the heavy machinery is concerned, then you can learn how to be in that flow state and hear that small, quiet voice, even when there's chaos around you. I feel like that's the goal for everybody, to be able to tap into either voice, the instinctual voice or that flow state voice, that loud voice or that quiet voice. Intuition is described many times as this inner knowing. And I want to add to that concept a little bit. You know, one of the things that I learned as a young child, when I started to understand intuition a bit better and really put it more into practice in my teenage years, is that the best practice for me is to use my intuition along with my heart and my mind. So I always used to say that the intuition is where it starts. That's important. But when all three of those are in alignment, man, you're on fire. That means you are moving in the right direction, no doubt. But when your intuition is telling you something and your heart and or your mind is not in agreement, it's not aligned, well, that's where your gems are. That's where you get to learn more about you, because your intuition is always right. If you go back to the original definition of what I spoke about just a few moments ago, you're tapped into the source. You're tapped into God. So anything, if you're truly tapped in, tuned in, it's right. I can say for myself that my intuition has always been spot on. It's just trying to get my heart sometimes and my mind in alignment with it. Now, there are situations where you don't have time for that. And in those situations, for me, I do my best to rely on my intuition. But sometimes, you know, I'm human, just like everybody else. My head will win out, or my heart will win out, or both of those are in agreement. And, they kind of gang up on the intuition there. But what winds up happening is that after the situation is done or finished, I'm like, oh man, I should have listened to my intuition every time. And I know that there's somebody out there or somebody's out there that agree with me 100%. How many times, did you know? You knew, but you went ahead anyway, right? So in that as well, there are gems. You want to use this protective gear as much as possible while you're mining these gems, but your intuition will protect you along the way when you are mining these gems. And the reason why is because there's also a timing to things. You know, if you look at things from a spiritual aspect, I'm sure many people see a lot of things about themselves, but that doesn't always mean that you are ready to deal with those things. Yes. And when you look to work on, or you look to mine these gems, you want to be sure that God is involved in that whole process. Like I said, in the Relationship with God podcast, because he's going to guide you. It's almost like a map, right? That great excavator. It's a map to what you need to work on first. You want to make sure that you're working on things in a manner that will help you and not hurt you. And this is where your intuition, you'll know when it's time for you to address something, when it's time for you to dig up this gem or, refine it and then finally shine it, right? We'll get into more of that later too, but you'll have that inner knowing. So if you, for example, You pray. You remember in the podcast when I talked about some of the things that you can do, I believe it was in the prayer podcast, some questions that you can ask concerning what you need to work on and why. Well, your intuition is going to give you those answers. Now, your mind might know, your heart might know, but I want to stress to you, and this is coming from somebody who has gone with her mind and has gone with her heart once again, and, kind of went full steam ahead before I was ready to deal with something. And it's so interesting because God is so good, because He will press that pause button on you. Like, you're not ready. You're not ready yet. I said you're not ready. It's like, well, then what am I ready for? Okay, now we're listening. Now we're tuned in. If your goal is to heal, there's a healing process. It's not a one-stop shop where you just, go in and get healed. Like it's instant and you leave. I wish it was like that. That sounds like an episode of Star Trek. Internally, it definitely is not that way. So just because you may know about an issue, and here's something else that's interesting. God may show you, like, this is for later though, not right now. This is what I want you to work on right now. And when you fast forward years later, you understand why you were told to work on this thing first and work on that thing second or third. But you may also understand why it was put in your mind at that time. Because God will, I believe, give you information. That's been my experience ahead of time as well, too, to prepare you. And then other times, not so much. But this is why you can never tell. Having that constant relationship, having that back and forth conversation, right? Prayer, meditation, stillness, nature, and intuition. It completes the conversation. There's so much that I want to talk about regarding intuition. But what I will do is sometimes I'm going to bring up the heavy machinery. Sometimes I'm going to bring up that protective gear when I start to talk about some of the harder issues, because I want you guys to remember, if it's something that is not a part of your daily practice, and there are areas of that myself that I work on, to make sure that it's a daily practice. And there are times when you're going to falter, and just know that that's okay. Just know that's okay. Speaking of that, we're going to talk about self-compassion as another piece of your protective gear on the next podcast, because that's important too. What happens when you fall off? What happens when you feel like you took, 2 steps forward and you take 10 steps back? Woo, that's painful. But that's where self-compassion comes in. And you're going to need a lot of it when you're healing. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. I pray that you build your relationship with God, love yourself unconditionally, and put in the work to mine, refine, and shine those gems.